Welcome everyone to yet another episode of the Economic Times Cutting Chai Conversations, where we try and delve into the DNA that goes into the making of all of the leaders up and down across the country. Very often, when we are chasing these visions of success that seem a bit far off into the future, you're trying to understand the building blocks of what makes the person, what makes the leader in question get over there. But um, we often sometimes lose sight of the forest for the trees, and we don't really look at the person behind the leader, trying to understand the formative events that might have led to them being a successful leader in the first place. Over the course of the series, we'll try and delve into the softer side of things, try and take apart the leaders, figuratively speaking, of course, to try and understand what drove them towards this success that has come to define them over so many years of their professional career. And today we have with us Santanu Bhattacharya as we look to get these conversations going further. Santanu, thank you so much for taking time out and being here with us at the Economic Times Cutting Chai Conversations.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan. Hope all is well on your end.
All well, all well. So I'll be doing the first leg of conversation with you, as mentioned earlier. Let's get this started then. I want to try and roll back the years a little bit, try and um, go to young Santanu, so to speak. Because often it's the case that our parents are our earliest teachers. Our parents, the support system entirely around us, our friends, our relatives. Were the early influences that really stood out to you, that shaped you, that really formed your the bedrock of your culture, so to speak?
Great. Thank you. That's a good question. It actually reminds me of my childhood. Thank you for bringing back the memories. There are three or four things that shape our lives, right, when you're young, right? One, the place sort of you are born in, right? The second is your sort of immediate family, and the third is the surroundings you sort of grow up in, right? So, from that perspective, I'm probably one of the most sort of unusual person you have spoken to. I grew up in the remote northeast part corner of India. I grew up in 5 states and 8 schools: Manipur, Meghalaya, Assam, Tripura, Bengal. Which means on an average, I stayed in the school for a year and a half, right? Um, Grew up in a family that was somewhat of a bohemian family. My father was in civil services, but at the same time, he was, by training, he was a physicist. He was one of the first batch of civil services officers who took a short course in IIM and became sort of the management, executive management graduates back in the late 70s. And he later on while working, he got a law degree and became a constitutional lawyer. He was dealing with the rebellions and all that stuff on behalf of the government. So it's a very esoteric background, right? One of the things that's common through the thread was essentially it was all about growing up. It was all about books and learning, right? What it meant was that my earliest memory of myself was going to a book fair in Calcutta at the age of 6 or so and carrying probably 8 or 10 books or whatever I could carry. With my mom carrying more books, with my dad carrying even more books, and my brother who was smaller than me trying to carry 1 or 2 books, right? That's like etched in my memory. Um, so the third bucket that sort of I was going after was the sort of your surroundings, right? We grew up in surroundings that were pretty esoteric, right? While the house was a bit of a science learning type of household, our
Mhm.
friends are largely in and around the what I'd call as a non-science circle. So my memory of growing up in Calcutta essentially um, was about Satyajit Ray, the famous movie maker. He used to come home maybe once a quarter.
Wow.
Poets, singers, movie makers, all type of people, politicians, So as a result of that, what I would have every pretty much weekend and sometimes weekdays is a Bengali thing called Adda, which means a bunch of people sitting together and talking about solving global problems. Bengalis are very good in solving global problems. Um, what should Bush do? What should Gorbachev do? Why is Fidel Castro not doing it? Bengalis have the argumentative Bengalis have the ways of sort of, to quote Mr. Dr. Amartya Sen, have a way of sort of going and delving into every topics. That sort of shaped what I did later on. If you look at my career, it doesn't look like there's one thing I sort of got stuck in, right? I did multiple things. And part of it was growing up the way I grew up.
So it sounds a little bit like Noah's Ark, where you've got to have one person of each kind in the house to try and propagate for the future of humankind. Because you've got one artist over here, you've got an intellectual, you've got an academician, and so on and so forth. You know, so it sounds a little bit like that. But yeah, would you say that stuck with you a lot? Because even throughout your career as well, you've worn a lot of hats. You've worked in the industry, you've foraged out on your own, you've been an academician. How do you reconcile all these so many different roles that you played?
So it's actually at the core of, see, at the end of the day, look, the way I look at the roles are facades of a building, right? If you may have a building with four sides, right? And the four sides may look completely different. Typically they don't, but you often have buildings where the three sides look different. The back side looks one shape, the side that's facing the highway looks one, and the third side, which is the grand entrance of the building, looks, So it's all of sort of the things that you do in our life are sort of our facades, right? But with
Right.
the top of that, you have to have sort of a couple of cores, right? The core of all of this has been sort of a quest for two things, right? One is go solve the hardest problem you can at that point, and second is work with the smartest people you can, right?
Mm.
Once you have those two sort of conditions satisfied, everything else is sort of on the edge. Can we raise money in a startup? Yeah, we'll figure it out. If you have smartest people going after the hardest problem, we'll figure that out, right? Um, can you go teach? Yes, if you're teaching the smartest people and teaching a class that's sort of very interesting, we'll figure out whether the classroom is well equipped or not, right? So if those are the one or two conditions that I always look at. And the other thing that I sort of do is what I call is a 7-year plan, right? I stick to something and stick to it for 6-7 years. The only way you sort of build strong competency around it, anything, takes about 10,000 hours. And 7 years, 5 to 7 years roughly translates into 10 to 15,000 hours, right? So when I did the PhD, I was one of the slowest PhDs, right? It took me 7 years, right? But it sort of built the foundations of things you can do. Then I moved on to doing something else, which is a startup. It took long, but you sort of ended up learning a lot, right? So as long as you sort of keep those cores, which is work on the hardest problem with the smartest people and stick to it for the long term, in the long run, everything becomes normal. All of this.
So, if I were to put a proverbial gun to your head, and ask you to pick one of these roles as the one you enjoyed doing the most, would you be able to do that, or is it a little bit like a mother being asked to pick her favorite child?
No, it's I can do that. I mean, at everywhere, people who see that, right? The the role that I'm always played is that of a academician slash teacher, right? Which is even at my startups, right? Key role that I've been playing. I mean, academics is my first love, right? By training, I'm an academician. By nature, I'm an academician, and luckily, the career I have picked largely deals with a large number of sort of academicians and other people. So that's sort of the first one, right? I recall when you had initially, before the recording started, you asked me, can you hear me? And you said loud and clear. And I said, yeah, you better hear me loud and clear. Because when you teach a class of 300 people, physics 101, you have to make sure on the 60th row they can hear you even if the mic is broken.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of first love. Yes, I can pick one. That's sort of by nature, I'm an academician. Then that's, and sort of it transcends into all the other roles that I have played.
But then that's where the whole dramatic bent of mind comes in, because you have to have the whole voice projection going all the way over to the very last row of the very last student.
And you have to be very good at something else. I'll tell you this. This is a secret, right? The thing is that what I noticed, right, the difference between teachers, good teachers, and great teachers, right? The great teachers are the ones that can understand human nature. There's I'll see, most of my life has been in the US, so I'll give you that contextual. There's a kid from Enid, Idaho, small town of 6,000 people. First time at the University of Maryland, right? Third largest public university. Physics 101, 800 students. He's shy, his head's down. You really have to realize that that's one student who is not getting what you are teaching. And you have to ensure that he sort of comes up to a level where everyone else benefits, right? Having some superstars and the rest of the class is mediocre, and rest of them as not making it, is not the sign of a good teacher, right? So ensuring that everyone plays as sort of the one team, right? And you'll have differences in competencies, you will have differences in the background, you will have difference in the speed of learning. But a good teacher sort of tries to optimize for all of that, right? So that's something that came very handy when I was sort of building my teams, building my startups. Again, everyone builds different kind of strengths, right? So the first thing you do in a class when you teach, guess what? The first thing you deliver as quickly as possible. It's actually that trust. The guy has to trust you that you are looking after his best, right?
Right.
Second thing is the respect, right? Which is be respectful for everyone's background, right? He may be from any Idaho, a small town, but there are things that he knows that you don't, right? And be respectful of that, right? The third is put yourself in other person's shoe. Think about when you are 18-year-old. I came from a very small town, right? When I went to IIT Bombay from Agartala, right? Agartala is the capital of Tripura. That time it had 1 lakh people. And 1 lakh is roughly a large apartment complex in Andheri, right? So when I go there, I was lost. I remember how it was. And I sort of vowed if I ever go teach, I'll make sure that the guy who is sort of, and I nearly failed in IIT because not because I wasn't smart, but because I just did not know how to deal with, the big town people, big city people. What would other think of me? And back in those days when I went to IIT, this was just about the pre-internet days, right? A lot of people thought, so back in those days, there used to be foreign students from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and all of them came to study in India. And some people actually thought when you said Northeast, they would very knowledgeably say, oh, Bangladesh, right? Yes. It was that and then that would put you down even more, saying that I come from a capital of a state in India, and some of my classmates have no idea, right? So that's the part of things, right? Build trust, be respectful, put yourself in other people's shoe, and then rest of it is sort of automatic.
It's actually a life skill you talk about. It's very pertinent because in 2020, with all these remote teams, everybody just scattered all over the place. The importance of, like you're saying, building a rapport, having a respect for somebody's time, being an open communicator, a strong communicator. I think these things become even more important in light of the events of 2020.
And you're guaranteeing there won't be anything after 31st December?
I'm optimistic, not widely, but I'm trying to be optimistic. Fingers, eyes, lids, everything crossed.
All right.
So, Santanu, if you could build like a hypothetical time machine, go back in time, talk to young Santanu, give him a couple of life lessons, what kind of advice would you put in his ear?
It won't be very different than what I just actually spoke about. So I sort of answered, right? It's like 3 things, right? One is go after really hard problems, right? If professional advice, right? And then go after really hard problems. So I'll give him do's and don'ts, right? So the do's I spoke about, which is work on hard problems, work with the best people, right?
Yeah.
I'll give him the don't advice, which very often, what I think today, the 22-year, 24, 25-year-old don't get advice and not on what to do. When I say what to do, they're always saying, oh, this is an old guy, like ignore him, right? What don't is important. Don't go after things that are short term, right? Title, salary. My friend is getting, such and such in such and such company, right? When you start for what I call is a vanity metric, right? It's like, when you measure download on apps that are proliferating, say I got a 1 million download, right? Is anyone using your app? That's a vanity metric, right? So title, salaries, and everything else early in your life for the first 10 years of our lives are actually vanity metric, right? You have to make sure that unless you're working on hard stuff with real smart people, surrounding yourself with very smart people, the things like title, salary, how many people report to you will eventually end up killing you because you'll optimize for this. Someone will give it to you, but you will not end up learning the deep stuff that's required, at least in our field, right? Our field is pretty deep, right? So for example, I'll give you a data science example. If you just on the surface, if you end up learning the algorithms, you go to the open source, download something, try something out, right? And it works. But if you don't spend the time understanding the mathematics and statistics behind it, you will fail because if the path that you're taking is easy, guess what? There are about millions of other people can do it. If the path you're taking is extremely hard, your competition by default is limited, or by definition is limited, right? So, so I'd say those are the things that you don't do. Don't go, go after vanity stuff. It actually feels very hard because what happens, your friends think you're an idiot, that you did not leave to go to the next startup, and didn't get a fancy side title of senior data scientist at the age of 23, didn't get the fancy stock options and all of that stuff, right? But the advice I've given throughout my life to the young people, and I have enough number of cases now who followed it versus who didn't follow. Most of the people who followed it, on an average, has been better than the others. So that's the advice I'll give to myself.
Right. Shantanu, I was actually going through your blog, I was trying to read up on you a little bit, and I was fascinated by a story you wrote on creating a drone economy in India. In much a similar vein, are there any other technologies that can have a great impact on our way of life, maybe not just in India, across the globe?
I'll tell you, you just picked on my favorite subject. Now you have to sort of give me a cue to stop because I can speak on it. I was a speaker this year at the World Economic Forum at Davos,
Yeah.
and I spoke about this one, right? I think so. Let me just talk about the context, right? There is a book called, I don't have it next to me, The AI Superpowers by Lee Kai-Fu, right? And one of the things that have impacted me, the reason I came back to India after so many years in the US, there's a New York Times article where he had written saying that, look, the future world would be dominated by two AI superpowers, US and China. And somewhat condescendingly, I'm not saying the exact words, it said that the rest of the world actually has a much easier choice. They just have to decide whose slave do you want to be. That to me was a shocking statement, right? But it's true. If that was the case, the way it looked like 5-6 years back, it would have been true, right? So I came back to India with one purpose of saying that, look, there's a US, style of building AI, which is largely driven by the DoD, Department of Defense, DARPA and all, and then the Googles of the world. There's a Chinese version of it, which is driven by largely by government and the Alibabas of the world. And there has to be a third way of the India, what I call is the India class solving problems, right? So if you look at 3-4 problems, and if you should probably take a look at sometime the MIT Emerging blog, MIT, like Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Emerging Market blog, Emerging blog. We talk about things that India can solve in order to make significant improvement in people's life. The first one, for example, is the address disambiguation. Sounds very easy. My house in California has one way of writing the address. You put that address, Google pinpoints it. My house in Bangalore, in 6 government documents, has 6 different addresses. And if you put it, it will point to different parts of the city, And that's only in big cities, very structured layouts. You go to Bombay, or you go to, for God's sake, you go to Kerala or Northeast. If you type in my address in my hometown in Agartala, it actually shows a 10 square kilometer area because the map doesn't know, right, where it is. So it actually has a massive cost to the economy. When I came back to India, the first company I actually went after, I have had multiple offers. I had just come out of Facebook. I was thinking of being a startup in India, decided that I'll learn the landscape first because I had not worked here much. But I chose to work with a very small company back in those days called Delivery because the problem they have had as a logistics company was solving the address problem, right? And that was sort of core to my heart. And if you look at it from from being a company with 16, 17 competitors, back in those days, there are so many logistics companies. Today, it's the undisputed leader in the third-party logistics, right? 2 or 3 problems like that, right? Put it in the top. So if nationwide, if you look on solving 3 to 5 problems, address disambiguation, figuring out a way, building an index for figuring out people's the economic prosperity. Today, the problem is that, I'll tell you, home finance, right? Rural loans. When I came back to India, I had an opportunity to work with multiple companies. However, the one that sort of stuck in my eyes was a company called Delivery, which was back in those days, one of the 17 companies in the logistics space. The problem we're able to solve, or we focused on, was the addressing problem.
Right.
Figuring out an address to a median distance of 50, 60 meters gives you unique ability to do a better routing. Or think of another problem, which is the economic prosperity index. Most of India, you don't have data on in the bigger cities, in the rich areas, right? You have some ideas of how much people earn, Kormangala in Bangalore, South Delhi, and so on. But we go to the smaller towns like Agartala, you don't have an idea, right,
True.
of what it is, right? You go to the even smaller places like Bihar, Samastipur, Darbhanga, right, etc. That information just doesn't exist. You have a census information. I have some ideas of what the population is, but the population migration in India is also very large, right? So once you start looking at this, and if you are, for example, a consumer products goods company who's trying to build distribution center, or if you're a rural finance company trying to lend, what it ends up building is inefficiencies in the economy. So for example, our estimate was on an average in rural areas, the amount of percentage insurance, a percentage that one pays for a loan is about 1.5% higher because you don't have information. And that's large, right? If, for example,
Adds up.
if your rural loan is stuck at 18%, it could have been as low as 16.2 had you just had the information. And it adds up a drag to the economy, right? So things like address disambiguation, economic prosperity index, and a bunch of other things that we can solve as India as a country, that will essentially give us a very different kind of boost. Our estimate was just solving the address will add about 10 to 12 billion dollars a year annually in India, which is about 0.5% of GDP. And then on top of that, if you can figure out the genders and the incomes, it will add another 0.5%. So you can permanently lift the GDP by about a percentage or so if you go focus on very, very specific, what I call is the India class problems.
Right. So, one thing I want to also touch upon with you, Santanu, a little bit away from the work side of things and the whole AI side of things you're clearly so passionate about. One of the big things I've taken away from 2020 is I guard my personal space very seriously away from the office, And 2020 has taken this big sledgehammer to it, just broken down all those barriers. Have you also really struggled to compartmentalize things, or has it been more easygoing for you?
No, I have to compartmentalize things. I wear so many hats. I mean, I have my job at Airtel. I have my academic sort of interest, research interest. Sit on a bunch of government and non-government committees. I don't have a choice. I have to compartmentalize. I have to give my hour saying that, look, between literally the days marked like between 10 and whatever, like 9 and 6 is my work hours. Then I drive home at 6:30. I have a call with Boston till 8. Then I switch back to the work mode here, finish off between 8 and 9. I do my emails. 9 p.m. I have calls. So I have to compartmentalize. So I don't have a choice. Unfortunately, that's life. But that has also done something very well, which is I see other colleagues of mine struggling. They're starting the day at 8:30. Some days they are going at till 11, right? That's because what's happening, things that in our area, it's a sort of a very interactive work. So for example, someone is not looking at their data set, don't have some questions. So they would have dragged her, she would have dragged her manager, who in turn would have dragged me, we would have gone to the conference room, drawn things on the board, argued, it would have been done in half an hour. Now someone has to make a call. At that time, the same person is on that call. By the time the whole thing gets sorted out, it's 6 hours, right? So longer hours, we are not necessarily becoming more efficient. So by forcing and constraint around it, I'm actually helping myself become more efficient. But that's everyone has their own way. I mean, of sort of managing the time that's been given to us now, or the interesting time we are in.
No, but it's a peculiarly Indian thing also, something when people say that if you sit for longer hours, you're generally seen as the more productive kind who's committed to the company, however you want to put it. So, I mean, even personally, when I look around me as well and some of my colleagues as well, they're putting in long hours and they're proud about it. I think it's not something just emerged recently. So it's a very long going Indian thing that we work hard and we're proud about it. I don't know why there's that pride and why it exists, but it does. So I don't know, maybe that's something to ponder, maybe not.
In my first startup, I used to tell people to leave. They'll come at 8, right, in the US typically, and at 5 o'clock, There's this lady called Michelle. I tell her, Michelle, go home. We don't pay you enough to do this. What it means is that you should finish work. A month later, same quarter, HR calls me saying that Michelle has put it in writing. You told her multiple times that we don't pay her enough. She needs a raise now. So that was, but
that was smart.
that was smart, taking my statement out in a context that suits her, right? But we should try to become more efficient, and in our business at least, people don't realize. I always tell that our efficiency factors are not people. Guess what our efficiency factors are? Machines and algorithms. So I run one of the smallest groups at Airtel. I have always run one of the smallest groups in the company that I have worked for. In fact, I have always joked that saying that given by my compensation over the number of people that work under me, I'm probably paid like 100 times the CEO on an hour or on that metrics, right? That's because our factors for efficiencies are not people. I mean, I would rather have 5 ultra smart people who know the best in the world than have a group of 50, right? So
Right.
that sort of ends up leading into a few interesting dynamics, because when I come and say, what's the largest group you have ever run? And like 13, people look at me and say that, oh, you haven't gone beyond like a senior analyst or manager position. The 13 people can change the world.
Yeah.
It's actually not 13, it's larger than that. But there have been times when I have led 13 people teams. And I'd rather see, you should measure always by impact. If 13 people can add 1,000 crores to your company's top line, I'd rather have those 13 people, right?
Very true. 13 of the best.
Yeah.
So clearly you're quite passionate about solving these global scale problems, these India class problems, like you put it so eloquently. Outside of the office, when you switch off, what are your pet passions like?
What are my big passions? That's a good question. I do watch TV once in a while, sci-fi. I was destined to be. I did my PhD at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. The only thing I grew up with was hearing the story of Yuri Gagarin, and I wanted to be a astronaut. I did make it to the astronaut training corps in Houston.
Oh,
On
really?
day 2, I got kicked out because I had, let's say, neglected to mention that I wear very thick glasses. That's not allowed. So I made it all the way there and got kicked out on day 2, right? So that's, if you look at it, that's sort of my passion: astronomy, space flights, sci-fi, all of that stuff. So I watch some of that. I write. Also, we travel quite a bit. Been to probably 30 plus countries, multiple continents. So those are things that teaches you about life. Like the space teaches you that things that you fight about, small things on Earth, are sort of insignificant. Travel teaches you, saying that, look, everyone is different, but respect that, and they can teach you so many things, right? I mean, life's lessons that I have learned, a lot of it's been by just going into other countries. Like, for example, take Burma, which is a neighboring country, right? A poorest, or Bhutan, a very poor country, right? But one of the happier, much happier than us, right?
True.
So you need to figure out, this guy sitting there will make 200 rupees a day, but he's always smiling. How do they do it, right? And it's not that smiling is sort of their character. They don't know what else to do. They're genuinely happy when you talk to them, right? So those are things that can sort of teach you. So those are 2 or 3 things I do. Watch some sci-fi stuff, passionate about space, and travel.
It's actually quite interesting, you mentioned Burma, because I don't think they measure their economy per se, by normal qualitative metrics. By quantitative metrics, they have a happiness index, if I remember correctly.
That's Bhutan.
That's Bhutan. All right. Yeah. So, on your travels, any particular place that really remains with you, or maybe you left a part of your heart back over there?
It's part of favorite. You are saying favorite places?
Yeah, favorite places essentially. Yes.
So the national parks in the US, many of them. California is always like heaven, and then the cultural centers in Europe. My favorite city in Europe is Salzburg, Mozart birthplace. I actually went to university. I ended up taking additional courses on Western music and Western painting. Of course, I did mention music and painting and the other passions, like listening, not trying either of them. I used to paint, but no longer do. Salzburg, Germany. I lived there for a little bit. The national parks in the US. And in India, it's the whole sub-Himalayan belt in the Uttarakhand, Uttaranchal. Northeast is always my favorite place. Grew up there. Yeah, way too many favorites. Kerala.
Kerala really is gorgeous. It's something else.
Yeah,
Uh,
it truly is God's own country.
it is. The food, the sights, the sounds, it's just something else. Um, Moving along then, you said you used to read a lot back when you were very, very young. Do you have time nowadays to read, or is that's gone a bit on the back burner?
No, I read. I still read. So I regularly order books. If you go to my desk in my office, it's I try to habitually order 2 books every month. So
Wow.
I'll order. Like, I try to finish off at least 2 books every month. I used to be able to do one every week, and large part after the lockdown, because I don't take flights anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Fly between. So in 2 flights, you can sort of finish one book. So
Yeah.
that's the every week, right? I used to go to Gurgaon every week at Airtel from Bangalore, and that sort of allowed me to keep that habit. Now with the lockdown, a lot of good habits are sort of falling apart. Hopefully, your 2020 prediction is correct,
I
which is
hope so. I really, really hope so with every sinew and fiber of my being. Any particular book that remains with you through 2020 that this was one heck of an epic read?
that's, that's a tough one. I mean, I have
It is, isn't it?
it's an
Tougher than having to pick out a role.
yeah. It's I mean,
Okay, take three then.
take 3. One of the fascinating book I ever read was The Ascent of Money,
All right.
which is it talks about how money came. Right, money is an artificial construct. Right, anything that's artificial construct and can control
Mm-hmm.
the world is very interesting.
Right.
Then the Bill Bryson's Brief History of Time. It talks
Ah,
about how sort of and then there was a third book I'm trying to remember. Uh, this is about history is one of my passions again. This is about how aliens came. How aliens came from in a small area in Iran and the southern part of Russia, right?
right.
So, Ascent of Money, Brief History of Crime, third one I can't remember, but it is an Indian author. I'll get it in a second. About how aliens came to India and how we established in the northern plains and how we sort of spread around the country, right?
It's very annoying when the name is right on the tip of your tongue and you just can't quite spit it out.
Exactly.